Ciao a tutti, sono Fabrizio dell'Associazione Culturale Sottosopra. Come sapete, l'incontro di oggi fa parte del ciclo tematico che abbiamo voluto dedicare sul tema dell'ecosocialismo e del Green New Deal, nell'ambito della quarta edizione di Sottosopra che abbiamo intitolato Le ferite del pianeta. La questione ambientale possiamo dire che è stata la chiave di lettura dell'intera rassegna di quest'anno. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di essere insieme al professor Joel Wainwright, che saluto. Good afternoon, professor. Thank you very much for your availability.
Saluti Fabrizio.
Buongiorno professore. Prima di passare alle domande vi presento il nostro ospite. Il professore è docente di geografia presso la Ohio State University. Il suo ambito di ricerca spazia dall'economia politica e allo sviluppo, al cambiamento ambientale e alla teoria sociale. È autore di diversi libri, anche di diverse pubblicazioni scientifiche. Ricordo ad esempio The Colonizing Development, Colonial Power and the Maya, Rethinking Palestine and Israel, Marxist Perspectives. Inoltre ha scritto anche con il professor Geoff Mann il libro Climate Leviatano, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future. Io qui ho con me l'edizione in italiano, come potete vedere, che è per titolo Il nuovo Leviatano, una filosofia politica del cambiamento politico, edito da Treccani. È un libro che ovviamente invito a tutti alla lettura, e oggi discuteremo proprio di questo, nel quale gli autori riflettono sulle probabili conseguenze che la disastrosa crisi ecologica sta determinando e continuerà a fare. In particolare si intravede da una parte uno scenario nefasto, cioè l'affermarsi di uno stato globale regolatore guidato dall'elite del pianeta, che gli autori chiamano Leviatano climatico, ma dall'altra si gettano le basi per un'alternativa radicale a questa degenerazione politica totalitaria di portata globale. Adesso passiamo alle domande. Let's switch to English and start with the question. For the first question, Professor, I would like to ask you, why did you choose Hobbes to talk about climate leviathan, and how is it related to our time?
Okay. Well, first of all, before I answer your question, Fabrizio, I just want to say thank you. Grazie. It's a great pleasure to be here. Please let me know if I'm speaking too quickly. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm speaking clearly. And I'd also like to take a moment to say thanks to Treccani, our publishers in Rome. Jeff and I are delighted that they were capable of translating and publishing our book in Italian. And it's been a wonderful pleasure this year to develop conversations with scholars and activists and thinkers in Italy as a result. And I appreciate the opportunity for the conversation. And also, I should mention that Jeff Mann, my co-author of the book, sends his regards. And so I wish he was here as well, but perhaps another time. Let me turn down my mic or my speaker so we're not getting too much feedback. So if I could repeat your question to make sure I understand you. You're asking, why did we turn to Thomas Hobbes, of all people? It's a fair question. Let's be honest. Most people think of Thomas Hobbes as a reactionary political philosopher. He's not very popular on the political left, to say the least. In fact, he's often held up as something like the enemy, the bad guy. So Jeff and I turned to Thomas Hobbes for a few reasons. In the first place, Hobbes, as you may recall, wrote his foundational political text, Leviathan, at a time when England was undergoing radical political change. And it was not clear how it could work its way out of the crisis. And so methodologically, Hobbes had to develop his ideas on the basis of a rather speculative pattern of thinking. Essentially, he tries to prognosticate where things could go, but also, in so doing, tries to make an argument about what would need to happen, what would be necessary for the crisis to be resolved. So Leviathan is a very strange book. On one hand, it seems to be merely describing what a sovereign is. But on the other hand, it's prognosticating or speculating in a specific way to say what must be. And the alternation between those two modalities of thinking and writing is part of what makes Leviathan such a foundational text. Jeff and I are not strict followers of Hobbes, to say the least. We don't agree with him on his fundamental political commitments. At least not all of them. I suppose in some cases we do, but that's another discussion. But what we take from Hobbes more fundamentally is something like the spirit of his position. And by that I mean the following. Climate change is a very grave political problem. I think we can all agree on that today. The question is, how does one even begin to think about the politics of the present and the future in the face of rapid planetary climate change? And one way to do so is to try to imagine that you are in a position akin to Hobbes, amidst a global crisis or a crisis of the world as far as you know it, and to try and speculate in a reasoned way about what would be necessary for the crisis to be resolved in a particular way. And so in that sense, we really were imitating Hobbes in this book by asking the following question. If the world does not quickly decarbonize, if it does not quickly bring down the carbon emissions, what then will happen? And if we imagine various possibilities and we anticipate those, how can we respond in such a way that increases the possibility that we could have equality and liberation in the future, greater than we have today? So that's why we turn to Hobbes. In that sense, our book is an homage to Hobbes, but obviously, whereas Hobbes was in a sense trying to protect and indeed also re-inaugurate the modern state, part of the argument in our book is that sovereignty is undergoing a change in the future, and we're advocating for radical direction. So in that sense, obviously, we're quite different from Hobbes. And as the reader of our book will discover, we also borrow fundamentally from the Marxist tradition to, as it were, complement a Hobbesian effort at prognostication. Did I answer your question, Fabrizio? All right.
Yeah, Professor, thank you. Now, in your book, you reflect 4 policy responses to climate change. What do you mean by climate Leviathan, and why do you think it is the most likely hypothesis?
Very good, thanks. So the book is entitled, in English, Climate Leviathan. The Italian title is slightly different. It's El Nuovo Leviatano.
Nuovo Leviatano, sì.
Grazie.
Yeah.
Grazie. So, but the concept is more or less the same. Because, again, as you know, the famous text by Hobbes is called the Leviathan. And what Jeff and I are arguing is that the present crisis, let me back up one small step. It's important for your listener to know that Jeff and I believe that the world is in the middle of a very serious global crisis, and that the present day political crises that we experience, for instance, in places like Italy, are not random, but are specific expressions of an underlying global crisis. And the crisis has multiple dimensions. It's a global economic crisis of capitalism. It's also a political crisis of the prevailing form of the liberal nation state. Alongside these is a global ecological crisis driven not only but mainly now by climate change. And our argument is that these different expressions of the crisis are tightly interlinked and that fundamentally are likely to get much worse in the immediate future. I say this, of course, and I take no great joy in this. I'm not any happier about this than you or my listeners. But this is simply our honest and most scientific expression of the world we're in today. So now the question arises, what will happen? It's possible, I suppose, that very little will change in the next few decades. But Jeff and I don't think that's very likely. We think that the crisis, as it worsens, is likely to bring about greater and greater suffering, greater and greater threats to the form of the political that we know, and that as a consequence, the world will undergo what we call an adaptation of the political. Not just marginal changes in the specific form of government here or there, but a more global change in how the relationship between the governed and those who rule, or the ruled and the rulers, is arranged. In other words, a fundamental change in the political. And this will take the form of the emergence of what we call planetary sovereignty, which would be a form of sovereignty that is predicated on a kind of planetary rule. Not necessarily world government in the sense that everyone is involved, but planetary in the sense that the management of the planet, the management of life on Earth, is fundamental to the validation of sovereignty. There are various ways this could come about. And in the book, we discuss some of these. Now, the next question that we have to ask is, what sort of sovereignty would this be? Would it be of a capitalist type, such as has existed in the world for the last few hundred years? Or is it possible that we could have something like a democratic, socialist, planetary sovereign? For many on the left, we think that's more or less what they're hoping will come into existence. Unfortunately, we might say, Jeff and I conclude that that is not actually the most likely scenario, and that the world is moving now in a direction where capitalism, in response to the global crises, rather than going away, will in fact intensify and will facilitate the adaptation of the political in the direction of the emergence of a new type of sovereignty, or we could say a new configuration of sovereignty that becomes planetary. So this combination of an intensified capitalist world with planetary sovereignty we call climate Leviathan. And we claim there are signs of its initial emergence or imminent emergence in the world today. You can read more in the book to find out more about that, but that's the general argument. But my final point here before I pass the mic back to you, Fabrizio, is to say that this is not by any means guaranteed. It's admittedly speculative thinking about where the world is likely to go. There are other possibilities. The scenario we call climate Leviathan is presently, we claim, hegemonic at the level of ideas, which is to say, it is where capitalist elites around the world perhaps would like to go. But their ability to create such a world is presently limited by what we call behemoth, because behemoth is historically the counterpoint to Leviathan, going all the way back to the Ugaritic myths from which these figures derive prior to the Old Testament. In the present world, we can recognize behemoth from, for instance, figures like Trump or Modi, or going back a little further to Berlusconi. One of the things that unifies all these figures, apart from the fact that they are extreme right men who take advantage of the extremes of neoliberal capitalism to put themselves in a position where they can manage the crisis in an authoritarian populist fashion. One of the curious things that unifies many of these figures is their position on climate change. Most of them are denialists, and they use fear of climate change, but also fear of what we might call scientific management of the future, to rally the people in favor of tradition and forms of authority. This is behemoth. And so far, this form of political reaction has been strong enough to hold back the emergence of Leviathan, which is obviously creating a huge tension at the world scale between a transition to a new type of political and economic response to climate change and the actual world that we live in today. Back to you, Fabrizio.
Thank you, Professor. Now, I would like to ask you, in several parts of your book, you expressed a reflection on capitalism at the center of the issue of climate change. For example, in particular, on page 28, you say, I quote, I take the book, we have a conviction that only in a world that has defeated the emerging climate Leviathan and its planetary sovereignty, while also transcending capitalism, it is possible to imagine a just response to climate change. So we can see that the left also addresses environmental and climate issue within the capitalist paradigm. And you devote a whole chapter on green capitalism and green Keynesianism. Make these premises what I would like to ask you. First of all, could you explain what you mean by this concept, and what is your critique on green capitalism? And finally, how is the green economy used by establishment?
Very good. Okay. Thank you, Fabrizio. So first, let me say that there are many people on the left today who are legitimately terrified about what is coming with climate change, and who would like to assist any forces in society in confronting climate change, specifically by finding ways to keep fossil fuels in the crust of the Earth. Climate change isn't very complicated, really. The physical problem is that human beings are changing the composition of the Earth's atmosphere in fairly marginal ways by increasing the amount of CO2 and CH4, or carbon dioxide and methane, relatively marginally, but with the consequence that a greater proportion of the heat that comes from the sun to the Earth stays around longer. And this is having dramatic effects on the world's climatic system, as we all know. So what do we need to do? It's very simple. We have to stop moving carbon from the crust of the Earth into the atmosphere. That means we have to stop burning fossil fuels. But that turns out to be very difficult because the global capitalist system is energetically driven by fossil fuels today. Admittedly, there is a fraction of our global energy system that comes from so-called renewable sources, like solar or wind or even nuclear. But as a total fraction of the Earth's energy supply, those sources have only increased marginally over time in terms of the proportion of energy that they deliver. So in the face of this, many smart people, including most liberals, have come to the following conclusion: that what we should do is use the capitalist state to change our energy system. This turns out to mean, among other things, ending subsidies for fossil fuels, and instead putting massive investment into creating genuinely renewable energy sources. It would also be very helpful if we raised fewer cows, for instance, by taxing beef consumption, and perhaps putting a tax on other forms of carbon emissions. For instance, special taxes on things that are essentially luxury goods that have a lot of carbon emissions associated with them, just going on holiday with an airplane flight. So this kind of thinking makes a lot of sense. We've even heard it from Pope Francis, who's written quite brilliantly and spoken out in favor of such ideas. And Jeff and I should be clear, support such measures in the short term. This is fine. Unfortunately, there are some good reasons why we have made so little progress in the past in actually delivering on these ideas. They all require something like a capitalist state that can operate on a planetary scale. Because if you think about it, take, for instance, the United States, where I live. I'm here in the state of Ohio. Historically, it's one of the highest levels of per capita emissions in the world. The local state has very close ties to the coal and gas industries. As much as we on the left in Ohio would like to cut off fossil fuels, the reality is that the local state is subsidizing more and more carbon emissions. Okay, so who's going to stop that? Where will the power come from that could change Ohio, or for that matter, the United States, which remains one of the largest emitters in the world, number 2 after China, and still near the top in terms of per capita emissions? Logically, therefore, we would need something like a global state or a global actor that could constrain local actors who are not doing their part with respect to global emissions. So we are confronted then with a problem something like that was faced by the world during the 1930s, when a global actor was necessary to reinvigorate global capitalism. In other words, we're very close to the terrain that was confronted by Maynard Keynes when he had to lay out an alternative conception of how to regulate global capitalism to facilitate economic growth and avoid crisis. And so it's not surprising to Jeff and I that elites and particularly liberals all over the world have turned to a style of thinking that we call Keynesian or green Keynesian to imagine how to solve this problem. And the puzzle essentially goes something like this. We can address the economic crisis and the ecological crisis together by using state-directed capitalist measures to stimulate growth of a green type. In fact, we claim this is more or less now the hegemonic answer to the question, what should be done about climate change, and endorsed by many people from the center to the left of the spectrum. Implicitly endorsed also by the Paris Climate Agreement. So far, however, as I've already mentioned, this kind of strategy has been held back because of the existence of behemoth-like political tendencies. But logically speaking, if you study the plans and you think it through, it will require something like what we call a planetary sovereign, an actor who can act in the name of the planet to regulate global capitalism. That is what will have to emerge if we remain within a capitalist framework and we seek to address the question of carbon emissions. So I haven't really answered your question about what the critique is. And I think many of your viewers might be looking at me and thinking like, well, I don't get it. On one hand, you're saying this has to happen, but you're implying it's not good enough. Let me try and simply present two kinds of criticisms. On one hand, there's a style of criticism that essentially says it's not going to happen. Like if we're just kind of honest with ourselves, we can see that there are reasons for being, how can I put it, skeptical in a healthy and honest way about the likelihood of the emergence of a global regulatory framework that could achieve a green capitalism, particularly because there's so many states, including the United States, where fossil fuel corporations have so much power over the capitalist state that they will simply prevent the capitalist state from achieving what you and I might want to be achieved. There's a second kind of criticism, though, which is more fundamental and brings us back to the terrain of Hobbes, which concerns sovereignty. What would happen if we were to resolve the crisis of climate change by creating a planetary regulatory framework backed up by elite capitalist management? It seems like this is something the left needs to ask itself now and prepare an answer to. Because if the cost of achieving a Green New Deal on a global scale is the re-regulation of global capitalism into a planetary scale, that could have major implications for reducing the democratic possibility of ordinary people, workers, farmers, and the like, to it creating greater forms of liberation in the future, including liberation from capitalism. Now, I must conclude by saying that I have friends on the left, including brilliant scholars like, let's say, Noam Chomsky and Robert Pollin, who recently wrote a book on the Green New Deal, advocating for it, who would say, I think in response to that sort of criticism, it's ridiculous to worry about such things when what we're facing is essentially, potentially, the end of the conditions of civilization as we know it. First things first. And they're right. To which my response would be something like the following, Fabrizio. What that means is that we have to address the climate crisis today on the existing terrain of the political, which is the terrain of the capitalist nation state. And we have to accept it. But we also have to remember a second truth, which is also true, which is that the existing terrain of the capitalist state is not amenable to the radical changes that are needed in the global system to achieve climate justice. And this aporia or contradiction, it seems to Jeff and I, is the fundamental contradiction structuring the global political situation. And it was in response to it that we wrote this book. And our hope is that by bringing political philosophical ideas to bear upon it, we might be able to free up more space for fresh thinking on the left. Back to you.
Thank you, Professor. Now, this is my last question for you, Professor, and then I remind everyone that if you want to do directly any question to the professor, you can write to YouTube or Facebook. So my last question is, given the radicality of our epochal crisis, we need, you said, radical alternatives. What is climatics and how you think this can happen?
Thank you. Our book has been criticized on many points, Fabrizio, legitimately by sincere scholars and thinkers and activists. But I think I can generalize and say that the most common criticism of our book is that we did not go far enough to concretely develop an explanation of our radical alternative, or what we call climate X. And so we get this question a lot. And I wish I could tell you, I've come up with a great simple answer to share with you. But I have to be honest with you and say, I haven't quite found it yet. And I don't think Jeff has either. So what I will say is I'll try and repeat some of what we said in the book, and then try and explain why I think it's so difficult for us to imagine a radical alternative. Because let's be honest, one way to understand our crisis today is as a crisis of the imagination. It's almost impossible for all of us to really imagine a radical alternative to the world that we live in today, with its combination of ecological, economic, and political crisis. That difficulty in imagining alternative is a symptom of the problem we face. So long as we have difficulty even imagining our way out, we will probably remain stuck. But now to your question, what is climate X? Let me try and explain it first formulaically, and then perhaps I can elaborate a bit. For those who have not read the book, there is a figure in the book, figure 2.2, which looks something like this. I won't walk you through the whole thing. It is a very simple Punnett square, 2x2 square. On the top two scenarios describe futures where the world essentially remains governed by capitalism. That is to say, it's possible that in the future, the global economy will continue to be essentially a capitalist one. It's also possible, however, that somehow humanity will transcend capitalism and create something like a socialist or a communist or post-capitalist alternative. Which way things go is obviously very important, because capitalism has within it certain fundamental tendencies, including an accumulation drive, which requires expansion, which makes green capitalism very hard to achieve, if not impossible. So clearly, I think we see that whether the future remains capitalist is an important dimension of future political possibilities. But it's not the only one. The second possibility concerns whether the existing world order shifts to become what Jeff and I characterize planetary sovereignty. So that allows you to imagine four possibilities. What we call climate Leviathan is the scenario where we have the perpetuation of capitalism and the imminent emergence of planetary sovereignty. What would be the opposite of that? That's the question we wanted to ask in the book, ultimately. If that's the trajectory we're on, what would be the opposite of that? Well, putting it that way, even posing the question allows us to answer it formulaically by saying that the opposite of where we're going would mean a world that simultaneously transcended capitalism while also avoiding the fate of planetary sovereignty. When you put it like that, there's still a wide range of possibilities that exist. And because Jeff and I do not want to pin down that wide range of possibilities into one specific utopian vision, rather than give it a name and say, this is it, this is the radical alternative. In a gesture, I suppose, of humility, which has been interpreted, I think, by many as a gesture of vagueness, understandably, we simply call it climate X, where that X represents a puzzle to be solved, an unknown, like in a math formula, where you say 4x equals 8 and you solve for x. It's 2. So, but then this raises the question, how do we solve for x if climate X is the future? Well, essentially it means that we would have to quickly shift to a non-capitalist global economy. We would have to have something like a world revolution where we overcome and transcend capitalism, reorganize economic life on the basis of collective or cooperative production and consumption. Our exchange relations, rather than being based on non-reciprocal exchange, would have to be based on genuinely free and reciprocal exchanges. And then all of this while confronting the existing form of sovereignty with all of its problems. I'll just mention in passing the violence that is subjected to people who are so-called paperless or so-called illegal migrants in the world system today. And while avoiding the fate of an authoritarian form of sovereignty operating at a planetary scale. We are so far from achieving this, Fabrizio, that even to speculate on it can sound a bit ridiculous. But we're not trying to sound ridiculous. What we're trying to do is to suggest that humanity confronts a very grave problem today, and we need very quickly to move in the direction of such radical possibilities, because otherwise the future will probably portend grave and serious problems for most of humanity. So that is probably a preliminary answer. Perhaps you have follow-up questions, but that's my starting point. Back to you, Fabrizio.
Thank you, Professor. Now, thank you very much. Now I see 3 questions from the public. Can you read, Professor?
Let's see. I see a private chat. If I touch on comments, no. Wonderful.
If you want, I can read, or if you want to read, you are.
Yes, I will. Perhaps I can read them out loud, but for my knowledge, will the readers of this show be able to see these, or will they only hear my voice?
Can you read?
Let's not worry about it. I'll just read the questions and try and respond to them. The first question comes from Alessandra. Thank you for the question. I'll read it and then I'll try to reply. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Thank you for your report. My pleasure. In your book, you cite the forgotten in Italy Antonio Gramsci. Oh, no, please don't tell me he's been forgotten in Italy. That can't be true. You have the new national edition of the prison notebooks in publication. You have the great work of the Fondazione in Rome underway. The International Gramsci Society hard at work. Anyway, I take your point. Not as well known as he should be, Antonio Gramsci. Quote, Gramsci reminds us without delay that every time we confront the question of the political, the problem of the unity of history and nature is raised. Isn't that a wonderful quote? It's humbling to read those prison notebooks in the face of a political crisis and to see again and again the depth and rigor of Gramsci's insights. Incredible. We are confronted with awareness. Climate change is a perfect example that wondering what makes history happen also means wondering what makes nature happen. You put it beautifully, Alessandra. Could you explain better why these references to the thought of the Italian philosopher? Yes. To put it very bluntly, if Marx gives us the foundational analysis of what capitalist society is and why it operates the way it does, it must be said that Marx did not provide us with a similar foundational analysis of politics. He gave us many important insights. One can read texts like, the 18th Brumaire or so forth. But for an analysis of the political within the Marxist tradition, Jeff and I turn first to Gramsci, where, specifically in his prison notebooks, he developed a profound and original conception of the political, which is the one which we use in counterpoint with Hobbes in this book to try to develop an understanding of the present crisis and where things could go. But now then you may wonder, well, what is this conception of the political and why is it so useful today? And I have a lot to say about that, but I will simply say, apart from our own book, I might recommend the work, the text by Peter Thomas called The Gramscian Moment, where he essentially elaborates on the claim that Antonio Gramsci's conception of the political was especially innovative and demonstrates philologically how it emerged between essentially 1930 and 1933 through the prison notebooks. So I hope that's enough of an answer. If not, please follow up, Alessandra. I'd be happy to say more. The next question comes from Fausta, who writes, I wonder which political subjects can implement the radical changes you are thinking of. Perhaps mine is only the pessimism due to the Italian situation. No, Fausta, it is not because you are Italian that you are pessimistic, because unfortunately, everyone around the world shares a certain pessimism today. That our pessimism is legitimate insofar as it is derived from an honest assessment of our situation. We are in a crisis. Of course, as you know, if we only remain pessimistic, then we will not act. And we must act to bring about radical change, which leads to your question. What is the form of political subjectivity adequate to the change ahead of us? I have a short answer for you. I don't think there is one form of such political subjectivity which is adequate. There will probably be multiple forms, but that probably sounds hand-wavy, like pluralism. So let me say a little more. For a long time, on the left, at least in Europe, I think many people believe that the form of political subjectivity adequate to the overcoming of capitalism was called the proletariat. The theory, of course, comes from Marx. The idea is that as capitalism develops, more or less everybody becomes a member of the class called proletariat, where we sell our labor power as a commodity to earn a wage, which we then use to buy the commodities we need: apartment, food, entertainment, and so on. Marx's theory was that the proletariat was a unique sort of class, which by virtue of its eventual unification through the process of being combined through the production process, but also being unified through a kind of emerging global culture, would lead to eventually the transcendence of capitalism. It's possible that he was right, but unfortunately the evidence suggests that the proletariat as such, as a form of political subjectivity, has not proven adequate to overcoming capitalism. Now, again, it may be possible that we just haven't waited long enough. But it's also notable that in many of the places where many interesting experiments have occurred on the left around the world, the class position of those at the center of the most interesting actions were not classically proletarian. Just to give some examples, I think of the peasants who created interesting developments on revolutionary movements around the world, who were not proletarians, but peasants. Or think again of people who were not quite proletariat because they might want to be selling their labor power, but who were essentially cast out of the global labor market. So Jeff and I are on the side of those social thinkers who would say, Marx had a legitimate point about the proletariat as a leading social group within future social movements. But we don't want to be overly economistic or narrow in our conception of potential forms of subjectivity. Needless to say, the entirely necessary confrontation that we face in the world today with things like patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, and so forth also remind us that subjectivity is not just about class. So, what about climate change in particular then? Well, it seems to me that with the world we live in today, one of the greatest injustices is essentially the following. If we ask the question, who is causing this problem the most in terms of subjectivity? And who will suffer the most the consequences, again, in terms of subjectivity? The answer goes like this. This problem is caused mainly by the elite bourgeoisie of the entire world, but especially from the wealthiest societies. And who will suffer the most? Why? It is the poor, especially the poor of the future, those who are not yet even born, as well as, of course, all of the species with which we share the planet. This way of thinking allows us to ask how we can approach that access as a problem of political subjectivity. Anyone who could take the side of the poor and the future against the bourgeoisie who are burning the planet potentially can contribute to this emergent form of subjectivity. I know that probably sounds, again, hand-wavy and pluralistic, but it's not really, because at least it gives us an axis to clarify who we are fighting for and who we're fighting against. Our next question comes from Mario. What do I think about the Green New Deal proposal by Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez? Thank you for being very direct. I believe it is both the best we can do right now in the United States and also insufficient. Let me try and elaborate briefly. For those of you who are not aware, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have put forward a plan calling for massive investment in new forms of green energy, the creation of so-called green jobs to facilitate employment, as well as the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. On the face of it, I think it's a great idea. and I fully support it. However, there are two problems. First, I'm sorry to say this, but given the existing political conditions in the United States, particularly in the US Senate, it cannot pass. And also, Joe Biden, our coming president, has already tried to distance himself from it. And unfortunately, right now in 2020, we do not have a large enough environmental or climate movement to quickly pressure Biden and the Senate to push through a Green New Deal plan of the Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez type. So the bill that we will get will fall short of, I think there will be a bill, but it won't be as good as that one, let's put it like that. But I have to go further and offer what might seem like an even more radical critique. If you open up the actual House resolution that was put forward by Ocasio-Cortez, it is striking that it says so little about reducing carbon emissions. It has all kinds of things in it that I like: universal health care, increasing employment opportunities, increasing wages, recognition of our debts to indigenous people, all things which I agree with. But if you look at what it says about decarbonizing capitalism in the United States, it's extremely vague. What does this tell us? It means even on what we might think of as like the farthest acceptable left-wing position in US politics today, even there, if you say, okay, well, we have to very quickly do what the scientists tell us is necessary, even there, we find silence. So, again, we have a lot of work to do. Our next question comes from Emanuele. Thanks for the interesting talk. My pleasure. I was wondering whether you have any space for central banks in your analysis. Oh my God. I'm laughing because my co-author, Jeff Mann, has been writing about central banking for about 10 years, and he's currently working on climate finance as his major project. So if Jeff was here, I would like him to take this question, but I'll do my best. I guess they would be the ultimate form of global green capitalist elite, as they would have weaker links to sovereignty. Or would the legitimation of climate objectives to independent authorities allow the sovereign to focus on distributional implications? Great question. Thank you. Emanuele, you have put your finger on one of the big problems that we face today. Think about it. Many of us are basically cheering for capitalist elites to get their act together and create a global system that could simultaneously bring down carbon emissions while accelerating growth and employment. We want, if we're honest, a Green New Deal that is global. But as your question points out, that implicitly implies something like a global central bank. Do you want a global central bank? Possibly, more than likely, operating on the sort of principles that the European Union has created its European Central Bank to operate upon? You can see the problem there. That is exactly the sort of problem that leads us to say we need to have a confrontation with the problem of capitalism and sovereignty. Not because we are political philosophers who fetishize sovereignty. Some might think that's true. That's fine if that's your criticism. My response would be to say, Jeff and I are not fetishizing sovereignty. It is a genuine problem in life. It is what the field of the political presents to us specifically because of climate change. In other words, to go back to Gramsci, what he was saying in that notebook was, every time there is a genuine crisis of the political, it is because there is something about history, politics, and nature that is in change. Well, obviously, history, nature, and politics are presently changing. So we shouldn't be surprised that a crisis of the political is unfolding at the same time. Our next question, and let me stop for a second and say, thank you for these wonderful questions. Please do not be afraid to criticize. If anyone wants to say that we're wrong about something, we welcome it. Okay, our next question comes from Mario. Mario writes, Joe Biden proposes a liberal policy based on the green economy and corporations. Well said, I agree. In South America, the most progressive examples from Bolivia to Brazil, there have been openings to extractive capitalism. Unfortunately, I agree. In the very polluted China, the state is investing in solar and emission reduction. but that is probably not even a model. Do you have any virtuous examples in mind? First, I have to make a small quibble with your claim about China. I do think that they have a model in place. And in fact, I would say that of all of the largest capitalist economies in the world, China is the one that has the most fully articulated, fleshed out, and explained model for reducing its carbon emissions. We should give credit to China for this. It is not capricious. It is not an accident. It is the result of long struggle within the Communist Party of China. Unfortunately, China's model also proposes emissions reductions that are too slow for humanity. And, I might add, China is presently building what Jeff and I would call climate Leviathan, where China and the United States, perhaps the European Union, would be at the apex of a new kind of planetary sovereignty. That is not what we want. So now I take your point. Do we have any virtuous examples? We do not have any virtuous examples if, like your list, we are looking for the names of existing capitalist nation states, because that's part of the problem, to be honest with you. Our virtuous examples might look very different. Let me just give one. The scale of the challenge which we face today may have no historical paradigmatic counterpart. In other words, it might be unique, but it's easy to always say that, and one never knows. So let me give something that's proximate. The struggle against slavery. As we know, human societies all over the world systematically adopted slavery for at least around 5,000 to 10,000 years. Today, slavery is not gone, but it has been dealt a series of decisive blows. For instance, in the country where I speak to you from, we had our largest war, the Civil War, over the question of slavery. So I think we can assume that from its inception, humans have always objected to slavery, most especially those who were enslaved. But it took thousands of years for humanity to forcefully confront slavery and overcome it. And doing so took tremendous amounts of violence. Why is that a useful parallel here? Because the reason it was so hard for so many societies to eliminate or overcome slavery was because it was in the interest of the slave owners to maintain it. We need to overcome fossil fuel capitalism right now. It is definitely against the interests of most elites for us to make that change, most especially those who have ties to fossil fuel industries, which means the elite of many of the world's most powerful states. Because as you know, from Russia to China to the United States, many of the most powerful states are also major fossil fuel producers. Does this mean that we are doomed? I don't think so. It means that somehow we have to undergo a change very rapidly, which previously was only possible very slowly. There are a limited number of ways that we could achieve this, but and one, of course, would be to have something like a simultaneous world revolution that put something like a revolutionary version of the Chinese state on top of global capitalism and brought about a very, very different type of global economy with much lower carbon emissions quickly. That sort of scenario where you have revolutionary government-led, anti-capitalist planetary sovereignty. I know that's a mouthful, but you can see it in the book if you're interested. We call climate Mao in homage to Mao Zedong. For many on the left, I think that's where they're going mentally. That's what they're cheering for at this point. We are not Maoists, however. And so our vision is different, but also admittedly more speculative, as I said earlier, with respect to climate X. Okay, at this point, I'd like to turn to the next question, but all it says is, no. Angela has simply objected, and I'm not sure whether you're objecting to everything I have said which would be fine, or just some component, or perhaps it's the way I've combed my hair, I don't know. But all I can say is yes. We're out of questions unless you have one, Fabrizio.
So, Professor, we had a lot of interesting questions, but also a lot of interesting answer. Thank you very much. It was truly my pleasure to do this interview. Thank you for making this precious reflection possible. So we hope to
Fabrizio,
see
it's been my
you
pleasure.
again soon.
Grazie. Thanks to everyone for your questions. And please, final thought, if I may, is that don't forget the motto which your wonderful thinker Antonio Gramsci adopted in prison under fascism. Even in prison, he was able to produce some of the most universal and important insights into politics ever recorded, because he adopted a certain psychological disposition which refused to look away from the actual crisis, the crisis of fascism of his time. And he said, we have to maintain a pessimism of the intellect. He was right. But he said, we also have to remain and maintain with an optimism of the will. Otherwise, we will simply cease to act and dream of a better collective, free future for all. So let us try and maintain both in the face of climate change, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Thank you. Grazie.
Grazie a lei, professore. Arrivederci. Grazie a tutti e vi ricordo i prossimi appuntamenti e vi ringrazio anche per aver partecipato così attivamente. A presto.